Welcome to Nightfall Tales. Take a slow, gentle breath in and softly let it go. Settle into your bed or favorite chair. Gently close your eyes and let your body relax. As you unwind, I'd love to know where you're listening from, your city or country. Down in the comments. It's so comforting to feel this quiet. Let my voice carry you softly to a place where imagination wanders and calm dreams begin. The castle does not sleep so much as it waits. There is a difference, and Frederik has learned it over 40 years of nights. The difference between a thing that has closed its eyes and a thing that has simply grown still, holding its breath in the vast, patient dark. Sleeping creatures may be startled. Waiting ones cannot, and Kronborg has been waiting for so long, through so many centuries of tide and wind, and the footsteps of kings, and the footsteps of tourists, and the footsteps of one old man with a lantern, that nothing can startle it any more. It has settled into its stones the way a very old person settles into a very old chair, with a kind of absolute boneless permanence, as though it has decided finally that it will not be moving again. Frederik moved through it like a small flame moves through a cave. His lantern held its light in the corridor of the east wing, a warm and trembling circle on the cold grey stone, and the shadows gathered on either side of him as he walked, not menacingly, but the way shadows always gather around a single source of light, leaning in with a quiet, patient curiosity. The tapestries hung on the walls, great dark rectangles in the dimness, and as he passed, the lantern light caught the edge of one, and for just a moment, just the briefest, gentlest moment, a thread of gold came alive in the cloth, a horse's flank, the hem of a robe. Then the light moved on, and the gold went back to sleep. His footsteps were soft on the ancient stone. He had learned this too, over 40 years, how to walk in a sleeping place, how to let the heel come down first, slowly, with care, so that the sound was not a knock but a whisper, how to carry a ring of keys without letting them jingle. He kept them pressed against his thigh with his free hand, the cold metal familiar through the fabric of his coat, and they were silent as he moved. Beyond the thick walls, the sea breathed in the darkness. It breathed very slowly on winter nights. The sound of it arriving through the stone as something felt more than heard. A low, patient exhalation, a gathering and a releasing. The sound of something vast and indifferent, and in its indifference, strangely comforting. The Faerosond was black tonight. He knew, though he had not yet walked the ramparts. He knew it by the quality of the silence. A full silence, a silence with weight in it, the kind that comes when the water is calm and the wind has gone to rest somewhere to the north. And there is nothing between the shore and the horizon but the slow, dark breathing of the sea. He paused at the end of the corridor and raised his lantern. The great hall opened before him. He always paused here. Not for any practical reason. He had memorized every shadow of this room long ago, knew the position of every chair and rope barrier and informational placard that the daytime world had placed here to explain itself to itself. He paused because the room demanded it. It was the kind of room that demanded a breath, a moment of stillness before it would let you cross it. The ceiling disappeared into the darkness overhead, the lantern light, not even beginning to reach the vaulted arches far above. The walls were dark wood and darker stone, and at the far end, on its dais, beneath its canopy of faded red cloth that had once been a brilliant crimson, though Frederik had never seen it crimson, had only read that it had been, the throne sat empty in the half-dark. He walked toward it slowly, his footsteps barely whispering on the floor. The throne was not large, as thrones go. He had seen photographs of grander ones, seen the replicas and restorations in other places, but this one had a quality of settled authority about it, a solidity that had nothing to do with its size and everything to do with the air around it. The years that had pressed into the wood of its arms and the faded tapestry of its back. He stood before it for a moment, as he did every night, not in reverence exactly, and certainly not in awe, more in the way that one acknowledges something that has been there longer than oneself and will be there still when one is gone. A simple, honest acknowledgement. You are here, I am here. The night passes around us both. He turned and continued his rounds. The keys. There was a comfort in ritual that Frederik had never tried to put into words, because he was not much of a man for putting things into words. He was a man for doing things, for the small, deliberate actions that made up the hours between dusk and dawn, the checking of this latch, the turning of that handle, the slow walk down this corridor, then that one, the lantern held at a steady height so that its light swept the corners and the joints where the walls met the floor, looking for anything that did not belong. After 40 years, he knew what belonged. He knew the way the cold air moved through a particular door that had never quite sealed properly. He knew the creaks of the stairwells, which steps spoke and which were silent, and what it meant when a silent step made a sound. Tonight everything was as it should be. He checked the doors of the exhibition rooms, moving through the pale gleam of the lantern in which the glass cases caught the light and reflected it in brief, sliding sparks, artifacts, behind glass weapons and documents and small household objects that had outlasted everyone who had ever touched them. He did not look at them with particular interest. He had looked at them enough times that they had become part of the room in the way that the walls were part of the room. Permanent and unremarkable. He noted them as he noted everything, without sentiment and without inattention, up the great stair, along the upper corridor, where the windows looked out over the inner courtyard, and where, when he leaned close to the old glass, he could see the snow. It was falling. He had not known it would snow tonight, though he had felt the possibility of it in the air when he arrived. That particular stillness, that slight heaviness in the cold, the way the sky had pressed down toward the earth, as though it were keeping a secret. Now the secret was out. The flakes were falling in the courtyard below, very slowly, with a kind of elaborate patience, each one taking its time, as though there were no hurry, as though the ground would wait. The lantern behind him made the glass a partial mirror, and he could see his own reflection faint against the dark, an old man with white hair and a lantern standing at a window in a sleeping castle, watching the snow. The snow fell and the sea breathed in the darkness. He went to the ramparts. This was the part of the night he liked best, if he was being honest, and he was generally honest with himself in the way that people who spend a great deal of time alone tend to be. The ramparts in winter, in the small hours, were the most purely himself that he ever felt. The stone under his boots was uneven, and he knew every uneven place. The wind, when there was wind, came from the north, and he turned his collar up and kept the lantern close to his body to shield the flame. Tonight there was very little wind, only the faintest movement of air, cold and carrying with it the smell of the sea. He stood at the outer wall and looked at the water. The Fenrisund was dark and still, across it barely visible. The lights of Sweden were a thin, faint line on the horizon, not bright, just present, just there. The way a thought is sometimes present at the edge of sleep, without being quite formed. And here and there, on the water between the shores, the lights of ships passing. He did not know what they carried, where they were going. They passed in silence, unhurried, their lights moving so slowly that if he looked away and then looked back, they seemed to have barely moved at all. They were part of the night, these ships, part of the rhythm of it. They had been passing through this sound for centuries, different ships, different lights, the same dark water, and they would go on passing long after his lantern had been put out for the last time. He breathed the cold salt air and felt nothing in particular, which was its own kind of feeling. The snow caught in his white hair and melted there. He turned and went back inside. The chapel was at the end of his rounds. It was the last place he checked before he allowed himself the walk back to his small room below the old domestic quarters, where his fire would have burned down to embers, and his chair would be waiting, and the small battered electric kettle that he had brought from home would be sitting on the table beside the one good cup he kept there. The chapel was his last stop, always. He was not a religious man in any particular way, not irreligious either, just a man who had reached a certain age and made his peace with uncertainty and left it at that. But he respected the chapel, he respected the quality of its silence, which was different from the silence of the great hall or the corridors. The great hall's silence was the silence of absence, of all the people who had left. The chapel's silence was something older, something that predated the people, that would outlast them. A silence that had been there before the walls were raised around it, and would be there when the walls were finally and inevitably gone. He opened the chapel door. The hinges moved without complaint. He kept them oiled. The lantern light preceded him into the room, spreading across the worn stone floor, finding the old wooden pews with their carved ends, the simple altar at the far end, the high windows. That in daylight admitted a grey, northern, understated grace. At night the windows were black, and the ceiling above was black, and the chapel existed in a kind of deep intimacy with the dark. He raised his lantern and began to cross the floor. It was the gleam that stopped him, not a bright gleam, nothing sudden or startling, just the faintest catch of light on something that should not have been there, something on the surface of the altar that was not the bare stone he expected. He stopped. He stood quite still for a moment, the way he always stood quite still when something was not as it should be, not alarmed exactly, but entirely attentive, his whole self focused into a single quiet point of attention. Then he walked forward. On the altar, on the plain, cold stone of the altar, Where an hour ago there had been nothing, there lay a book. It was small, the size of a man's hand perhaps, or a little larger. Its cover was leather, dark brown or black. It was difficult to say in the lantern light, and the leather was worn soft with handling. There were no letters on the cover, no title, no marking of any kind. Beside it, touching its spine with a lightness that seemed almost deliberate, lay a single feather, white, from a seabird, a gull perhaps, or a tern. The white of it in the lantern light was very pure, very clean, the whiteness of winter, and the whiteness of the snow falling in the courtyard, and the whiteness of ice on the water in the deepest months of the year. He stood before the altar for a long moment. The sea breathed in the darkness beyond the shadows gathered in the vaulted ceiling high above. The lantern held its small flame. He set the lantern on the altar beside the book. He removed his gloves, tucking them into his coat pocket, and he reached out and touched the book first with one finger, just one, lightly, on the worn surface of the cover, as though to confirm that it was real and solid and present in the world. The leather was cool, smooth. It had been smooth for a long time. This was not new smoothness, but old smoothness. The smoothness that comes from years of hands. His finger traced the edge of it. Then, very carefully, he picked it up. The feather he left where it was. The book was light in his hands, lighter than he expected. He turned it over. The back cover was as plain as the front. He opened it, not brittle. They did not crack or resist, but yellowed in the way that paper yellows with age, going from white to ivory to the colour of old cream. A colour that has its own warmth in it, its own depth. He turned past the first page, the flyleaf blank. He turned to the first page proper, and there it was, written in ink that had faded to a soft brown, in a hand that was elegant and deliberate, each letter formed with care, for the one who walks where Hamlet walked. He read it once. He read it again. His lips moved very slightly, not in sound but in the shape of the words, as though he needed his body to participate in the understanding of them. He turned through several pages, gently, with the care one gives to things that cannot be replaced. All of them blank. The writing was only on the first page. The rest of the book, all of it, every yellowed leaf, was empty. He stood at the altar for a long time, the open book in his hands. The lantern held its small flame. The shadows gathered in the vaulted ceiling. He sat down on the stone step of the altar. It was cold. He felt the cold immediately through the thick wool of his trousers, the stone drawing the warmth from his body with the patient efficiency of stone. He did not mind it. He had sat on cold stone before. He would sit on it again. He settled himself and set the open book in his lap, and looked at the words on the first page, and the lantern beside him on the floor threw its light across the page, and made the old ink glow faintly, warmly, the colour of amber. For the one who walks where Hamlet walked. He turned the words in his mind slowly, the way he might turn a stone he had found on the shore, examining it, feeling its weight, looking at the way the light moved across it. Hamlet. They always came for Hamlet. He had watched them come for 40 years. The tour groups with their guides holding coloured umbrellas aloft, like strange bright flowers, the solitary visitors who moved through the rooms with the particular intensity of people who were looking for something they had already decided they would find. The students with their dog-eared paperback copies of the play, stopping in doorways to read passages aloud with a self-conscious reverence. He had watched all of them. He had watched them stand on the ramparts and look out at the sound and murmur lines about whether it was nobler. He had watched them descend to the dark cellars below the castle where the stone effigy of the old chieftain lay sleeping, because someone had decided long ago that this figure was Holger Danske, Holger the Dane, who would rise when Denmark needed him. They came for the stories. They came for the weight of literature pressed into the weight of stone, for the particular pleasure of standing in a real place that a made-up thing had made famous. He had no quarrel with this. People needed stories. He understood that, but he himself had never walked where Hamlet walked. He was not sure that Hamlet had walked anywhere, being a fiction, and therefore existing in the interesting position of having no feet to walk with, and the Elsinore of the play was not quite Kronborg. Was it? Not really. It was a place made of words, a place that had borrowed a name and a geography, and the general quality of northern cold and seacoast bleakness, and had made something else of them. He had read the play once, years ago, when he was new to the job, and felt that he should. He had found it interesting and somewhat exhausting. There was a great deal of indecision. He was himself a decisive man, in his way, not bold, not dramatic, but a man who knew what needed to be done, and did it without excessive agonizing. He checked the locks. He walked the ramparts. He noted the things that were not as they should be and attended to them. He had walked where Frederik had walked. For 40 years, Corridor D East Wing, the slight dip in the floor 3 steps before the window where the stone had settled over the centuries, and no one had seen fit to level it. The 5th step of the back stair, the one that creaked, a low, comfortable sound, like a small, sleepy complaint. The particular quality of the air in the northeast tower, which smelled of old iron and something else, something mineral and old, and which was always 3 degrees colder than anywhere else in the building, even in summer. The place on the inner rampart wall where a crack had appeared 6 years ago, and he had reported it and watched the workmen come and address it. The crack disappearing under new mortar, but he still ran his fingers along that section of wall each night, just to be sure, just to feel that it was whole. He had walked where Frederik walked, and he had not thought of it as walking anywhere in particular. It was simply the route, the work, the night's business, conducted with the same unhurried attention he had brought to it on the first night and every night since. But someone had seen it differently. He looked at the words again for the one who walks where Hamlet walked, and something shifted in him, slowly, the way something very large and very old shifts, the way a glacier shifts barely perceptibly, the movement measured not in moments, but in long, patient time. He had assumed, reading the inscription the first time, that it referred to the play, to the fiction, that whoever had left the book intended the compliment of identification. You, old watchman, are part of the story. You are a character. You belong to the drama of this place. But he looked at the blank pages, all those blank pages. The book was not a record of anything that had happened. The book was not full of history or story or drama. The book and the emptiness, he began to understand, sitting on the cold step with the lantern's glow on the page and the sea breathing beyond the walls. The emptiness was the point. The emptiness was what the book was for. Hamlet had been full of words, torrents of them, soliloquies and accusations and philosophical reflections, and feigned madness and real grief and the whole exhausting, brilliant machinery of a man who could not stop thinking long enough to act, or who could not act without first turning the action over in his mind until it became something else entirely, something more and less than action, something purely verbal, purely interior, a storm of language containing at its eye a terrible, paralyzed silence. But Frederik was not full of words. Frederik was full of footsteps, of the turning of keys, of the soft fall of snow in the courtyard, and the breathing of the sea, and the way the lantern light caught a thread of gold in a tapestry, and briefly, warmly, made it live. He was full of the weight of the ring of keys against his thigh, and the cold of the stone altar steps seeping through his trousers, and the smell of the chapel, old wood, cold stone, the faint ghost of candle wax from some ceremony months ago, the salt that found its way through every wall and into every room of this castle that stood so close to the sea that it was almost in some moods a ship. He was full of all of this, but he had never put it into words. He was not, as he had always known, much of a man for words. And here was this book, blank. Every page of it blank. Not for the one who watches over Elsinore, not for the keeper of the castle's history, not anything grand or literary or self-conscious, just for the one who walks as though walking were enough, as though 40 years of footsteps on ancient stone were the whole and sufficient definition of a life's work, as though someone had understood, which no one had ever said to him directly, that the walking itself was the thing, not what the walking guarded, not what it commemorated, but the walking simply, quietly, night after night, one old man with a lantern moving through the great cold dark. He sat on the step for a long time. The snow fell in the courtyard, visible now as a quality of particular stillness that entered through some crack or joint in the old walls, a coldness that was slightly different from the usual cold, carrying with it the particular hush of snowfall. The lantern held its small flame. His hands rested on the open book in his lap. He was not. He realized slowly, the question had presented itself to him briefly, in the first moments of discovery, and then had moved away again, like a ship passing present, then gone, leaving only the dark water behind it. He did not need to know. It was enough that someone had come here, someone who knew this place, or who had spent enough time in it to notice something, and had seen him, not the castle, not the history pressing itself into every stone and shadow. Him, Frederik, the night watchman, with his lantern and his keys and his 40 years of footsteps. Simone had seen that, and had left a book with blank pages to say so. He thought, perhaps that is what it means. Finally, not to be written about, not to be part of the story, but to be seen, once clearly by one person who understood what it was that you were doing and why it mattered. To have that acknowledgement exist somewhere, even in the form of an empty book on a cold altar, even in the form of a white feather from a seabird, resting against a worn leather spine. He breathed very slowly. The sea breathed with him. He sat there for a long time. He was not sure how long. Time moved differently in the chapel. It always had. The hands of his watch described their usual small, reliable circuit. But in here that seemed beside the point. He was not being negligent. Everything was attended to. The rounds were completed. What remained was the walk back. And the walk back could wait. When he finally stood, his knees spoke briefly and firmly about cold stone and the advancing years, and he listened to them with the philosophical patience he brought to all such communications from his body these days. He straightened. He looked at the book in his hands. He turned to the last page, the very last, the back flyleaf, and looked at it, blank. He turned to the page before it, blank. He considered for just a moment, finding a pen, writing something. He had pens in his coat pocket. He always had a pen for the nightly log that he kept in the watchman's room, the plain record of his rounds. He considered writing his name perhaps, or the date, or something, any mark at all, to say, I was here, I received this, but he did not. The blankness was right. The blankness was what the book was for. If he wrote in it, he would turn it into something else. A record, an account, a claim. He would make it a thing about words when it was a thing about the absence of words, about the space that opened up beyond words, in which 40 years of quiet work existed whole and complete and sufficient. He would be doing what the other one, Hamlet, the play's prince, the great verbal machinery, had always done, turning the thing itself into language, filling the silence with sound, missing the point of the silence in the act of explaining it. He closed the book. He picked up the feather from the altar. It was lighter than he expected, impossibly light, the weight of a breath, and the white of it in the lantern light was the whiteness of everything clean and cold and simple. He opened the book again, just enough, and he tucked the feather between the pages. Not the first page, not near the inscription, but somewhere in the middle, among the blank pages, as though he were marking a place that did not need marking, as though he were pointing to the heart of the book's emptiness and saying, Here, this is where the thing lives. He closed the book again. He went to the small shelf behind the altar, the shelf where the chapel's worn prayer books rested. 3 of them, old, their spines faded and cracked, the gilt lettering on them illegible now. He placed the book there, on the shelf beside the prayer books. It sat naturally among them. It was the right size. It belonged there in the way that old things tend to belong together, gathering in the same shelf or drawer or corner, as though drawn by the quiet gravity of their age. He pulled the door closed behind him with the same care with which he had opened it, and he stood for a moment in the corridor outside, the lantern held in his hand, the shadows gathering around him in the familiar way, and he let out a slow, long breath. The sea breathed in the darkness. He began the walk back. The castle around him was the same as it always was. This was one of the things he had come to love about it. In the undemonstrative way that he loved things, its absolute unresponsive sameness. The corridors were the corridors. The tapestries hung in the dark. The throne room was empty, and the throne sat on its dais with the patient, settled permanence of something that has decided not to be moved. The great stair descended as it had descended every night, for as long as he had been here, and for much longer before that. The high windows gave out onto the courtyard, where the snow was still falling, softly, without urgency, covering the stones in a thin white silence. He paused at one of these windows. He did not lean to the glass this time. He stood a little back from it, so that he could see the courtyard without seeing his own reflection. The snow fell, and the courtyard received the flakes coming down one at a time, each one alone, each one finding its place on the stone and coming to rest there. By morning there would be a proper covering, and the footsteps of the first daytime workers would break it, and the tourists would come through and leave their own traces in it, and by mid-afternoon it would be a churned grey mess of boot, prints and the evidence of the ordinary daylight world. But now it was untouched. He had always liked the way a fresh snowfall erased the evidence of human passage, not permanently, not meaningfully, just for a few hours, just long enough to suggest the possibility of a surface that no one had yet crossed. He was not, he thought, a sentimental man, but he was a man who noticed things. And this was one of the things he noticed, the temporary patient perfection of snow before anyone walked on it. He turned away from the window and continued down, the ramparts one last time, a quick pass, checking the gates, checking the locks on the outer doors, feeling the cold salt air on his face in the brief moments. He was exposed to the sky. The snow was lighter up here, or felt lighter, the flakes coming sideways in the slight movement of air that found the high places. The lights of the ships were on the Sound, 2 of them now, where before there had been one, moving their unhurried courses through the dark water. He watched them for a moment. He did not wonder about them. He simply watched. Then he went down. The watchman's room was at the end of a low corridor in the old domestic quarters, below the staterooms, a part of the castle that tourists did not visit. It was small and warm in the way that small rooms are warm, a warmth that a fire can manage, contained and intimate. He had banked the fire before beginning his rounds, and the coals were still red beneath their grey skin, and when he added 2 small pieces of wood, they caught quickly, and the room brightened and warmed around them. He hung his coat on the hook by the door. He set the lantern on the table, where it continued its small vigil out of habit. He sat in the chair. The chair was not much to look at, a plain wooden thing with a cushion he had brought from home some years ago, worn now into the shape of him. The fabric faded from its original dark red to something between pink and brown. He sat in it, and his body recognized it and relaxed. The slow, deliberate relaxation of a man who has finished what he set out to do and can now simply be still. He thought briefly about the book. It would be there in the morning when the first daylight workers arrived, if they went into the chapel, if they looked at the shelf, and they might not. They might not notice it at all, or they might notice it and assume it had always been there. One more worn and unmarked volume on a shelf of worn and unmarked volumes. Or they might notice it and wonder and investigate, and perhaps bring it to the attention of someone in administration, who would open it and find the inscription and the blank pages and be puzzled and perhaps have it examined. Something might come of it. some small institutional inquiry, or it might simply sit there among the prayer books for years. He found that he did not mind either possibility. The book had already done what it needed to do. He had received it. He had understood it in the way he understood things. Slowly, without drama, through a long sitting on cold stone while the sea breathed, and the snow fell, and the lantern held its small flame, the book's purpose was accomplished. What happened to it now was beside the point. He was tired in the good way, the way that comes at the end of a night completed, not the way that comes from being used up, but the way that comes from being properly spent. The fire murmured. The castle above and around him was enormous and silent, and deeply completely itself, stone and shadow, and all those centuries of waiting, all those centuries of holding the cold and the salt and the sound of the sea within its walls. It did not know about the book. It did not know about Frederik, or cared no more for him than for the tourists or the kings or the scholars who had passed through it. It was simply what it was, a great stone thing on the edge of the Sound, built to stand against the water and the weather and the long patience of time. He was glad to be inside it. He closed his eyes. Sleep came to him the way sleep always came in this room, not suddenly, not in a rush, but gradually, gently, the way the tide comes in on a calm day. His breathing slowed,